I grew up in a place where the sky felt endless, and dreams had to be stitched together from scraps. My mother worked 2 jobs in our small Oklahoma town, serving coffee at dawn, scrubbing office floors at night. She never complained. Instead, she taught me something more valuable than money, that grit is a currency all its own. I watched her count coins at our kitchen table, her hands rough but steady. Back then, I promised myself that one day I'd build a life where survival wasn't the only goal and I'd do it without losing who I was. When I first moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, the skyline felt like a promise I'd finally kept. I had a career in finance, a condo high above the streets, and a heart that believed in possibility. Then I met Ethan Brooks, a man whose easy smile could quiet a crowded room. He was charming, thoughtful in small ways, and carried a name that meant something here. Brooks Developments. To the city, it was a legacy. To me at the time, it was just his last name. I thought we could build something new together, brick by brick. Ethan's father, Charles Brooks, was the kind of man who turned blueprints into empires. People spoke his name with a mix of fear and respect. At our wedding, he took my hand, looked me in the eye and said, "You're sharp, Madison. Don't waste that." I didn't know it then, but those words would pull me into a world of steel glass and boardroom battles. I had planned on stepping back from my career, maybe starting a family. But life, I've learned, doesn't always follow the blueprint you imagined. It hands you a different set of plans. I grew up in the kind of town where people measured time by church bells and Friday night football games. Summers smelled like cut grass and rain on hot pavement. My mother, Lila, raised me on her own after my father left. She wore a waitress uniform by day, a janitor's gloves by night. I used to wait for her in the corner booth of the diner doing homework while she refilled coffee cups. Watching her work taught me that you didn't have to be the loudest person in the room to be the strongest. You just had to keep showing up. Our apartment was small enough that the kitchen table doubled as her sewing station. I remember the sound of her scissors slicing through fabric, the steady rhythm of her sewing machine like a lullaby. She'd mend other people's clothes for extra cash, always telling me, "Madison, you can't always choose where you start, but you can choose where you end up." I didn't fully understand then, but years later, those words became my compass. I saw how resourcefulness, not luck, was what kept us afloat. It was my first lesson in creating opportunity where none seemed to exist. In high school, I chased every scholarship I could find, scribbling essays late into the night. I learned early that doors didn't just open, you had to knock, sometimes twice. By the time I graduated, I had a full ride to study finance. College felt like stepping into a bigger world, one where my accent and thrift store clothes made me stand out. But instead of shrinking, I leaned in. I asked questions in class, volunteered for projects, and learned the language of numbers, the way they could tell the truth when people didn't. That skill would become my anchor. After college, I landed a job at a mid-sized bank in Charlotte. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I spent my first weeks soaking up everything: how loan officers read risk, how investments were balanced like a delicate equation. I once spotted an overlooked fee in a client account that saved the bank thousands. My manager pulled me aside and said, "You see things others miss." That moment stayed with me. It reminded me of my mother at her sewing machine, patching holes, making something stronger. Skill I realized is just paying close attention over and over again. Looking back, I see that the leap from a small-town kitchen table to a high-rise office wasn't one big jump. It was 100 small steps. Each one taught me something: resilience from my mother, precision from my studies, and adaptability from my early career. That's the truth about overnight success. It's usually years in the making. I didn't know it yet, but those years had prepared me for a meeting that would change my entire trajectory. And that meeting would start with a man named Ethan Brooks, and a last name that carried far more weight than I imagined. I met Ethan Brooks on a late autumn evening at a charity gala. I was there to help with the silent auction. He was there because his name was on half the donor list. He had that kind of charm that feels effortless, like a song you've known forever. We talked about travel books, and somehow ended up laughing over our shared dislike for lukewarm coffee. It wasn't fireworks, it was a steady warmth, the kind that makes you want to stay a little longer. At the time, I didn't know his family's company was practically a pillar of Charlotte's skyline. When Ethan finally told me about Brooks Developments, it sounded almost like folklore. His father, Charles Brooks, had started with a single construction crew and built an empire of skyscrapers, luxury condos, and suburban developments across the South. In Charlotte, the Brooks name was as much a landmark as the tallest building downtown. Ethan spoke about it with quiet reverence, but also a certain distance, like someone reciting family history rather than claiming it. I was curious, but I didn't press. In my mind, his family's business was just one chapter of his story. Our relationship moved at an easy pace. We cooked together, took weekend trips to the mountains, and spent lazy Sundays on the couch. When Ethan proposed, it wasn't in some grand ballroom. It was on a quiet dock at Lake Norman, with the reflection of the moon dancing on the water. I said yes, believing we'd build our own version of a good life, separate from corporate empires and boardrooms. What I didn't expect was how quickly his world and his father would pull me into theirs, whether I was ready or not. After our honeymoon, Charles invited me to lunch at an old steakhouse, the kind with red leather booths and a history older than the city's skyline. He didn't waste time with small talk. Madison, he said, this company needs people who see the big picture and make smart moves. I think that's you. He spoke about my background in finance like it was a blueprint he'd been waiting to use. I was flattered but also hesitant. I'd imagined stepping back from work, maybe starting a family. But there was something in his voice, a challenge I couldn't ignore. Looking back, I realized that lunch was my first lesson in how opportunity often wears the disguise of responsibility. Charles wasn't just offering me a job. He was opening a door into a world where my decisions could ripple across entire communities. I said yes, thinking it might be temporary, but as I walked out of that steakhouse, I felt the same determination I'd carried from my mother's kitchen table to my first office job. What I didn't know was that learning the ropes in construction would be like stepping into an entirely new language, and it would change me forever. My first day at Brooks Developments felt like walking into another universe. The office walls were lined with framed blueprints, each representing towers and neighborhoods I'd driven past, but never thought about who built them. People spoke in a language of permits, bids, and change orders. In banking, I dealt in numbers and forecasts. Here, numbers were tied to steel beams, concrete slabs, and timelines that could make or break a project. It was intimidating, but there was a thrill in knowing I was stepping into something bigger than myself. I decided to treat it like learning a new craft. Charles paired me with a project manager named Ray, a veteran who'd been with the company since its early days. He taught me how to read site plans, how weather delays could derail months of work, and why negotiating with suppliers wasn't just about price. It was about relationships built over years. I still remember one morning when Ray took me to a construction site downtown. The smell of fresh lumber, the clang of metal, the hum of machinery, it was messy, loud, and strangely beautiful. I realized buildings aren't just made of materials. They're made of hundreds of human decisions. My first real test came when I spotted an error in a supplier contract, an overcharge buried deep in the fine print. It wasn't malicious, just a mistake, but catching it saved the company over $200,000. At the next board meeting, Charles asked me to explain what I'd found. I laid out the details, tying it back to how we could reinvest those savings into better safety equipment. There was a moment of silence, then nods around the table. That day I learned that trust in business isn't granted, it's earned, often in small, quiet moments like that one. Over time, I began to see how construction mirrored life. You start with a vision, but the real work is in the foundation, the unglamorous parts no one sees. My foundation was my mother's work ethic, my years in finance, and now these lessons from the field. I kept a small notebook in my desk, jotting down insights from Ray Charles, and even the site foreman. Pay attention to what's not being said. Ray told me once, in business, silence can mean opportunity or danger. That piece of advice would prove more valuable than I could have imagined. By the end of my first year, I was no longer just Ethan's wife in the office. I was Madison, the one who could crunch numbers and spot gaps before they became problems. My confidence grew, but so did my awareness of Ethan's absence. He skipped meetings, brushed off calls from the project leads, and seemed content to let the family name do all the work. I told myself I'd focus on my own lane, but part of me knew that his detachment wasn't just a personal choice. It might one day affect the company we were both tied to. At first, I thought Ethan's absence from meetings was just a phase. Maybe he needed time to adjust to the pressure of the family business. But as months passed, the pattern became clear. He'd appear in the morning with his crisp shirts and easy smile, shake a few hands, and vanish before lunch. Sometimes he was on the golf course. Other times I'd find him at home, sprawled on the couch, a video game controller in hand. In contrast to my long days on job sites or in boardrooms, his hours felt unanchored, as if the company existed in a separate world. I tried to talk to him about it gently at first. "You know, the team could really use your perspective," I'd say over dinner. He'd shrug, cutting into his steak. "They've got you. You're better at this stuff anyway." Part of me wanted to believe it was a compliment, but deep down, I knew it was a way of avoiding responsibility. I'd seen this before in banking clients who inherited wealth, but lacked the drive to grow it. Without skin in the game, they were content to let others steer the ship no matter the cost. It wasn't just about the work, it was about the message it sent. In business, leadership isn't just making decisions, it's showing up. When the CEO's son skipped out on site visits or quarterly reviews, it didn't go unnoticed. Contractors whispered. Board members exchanged glances. I could feel their silent questions. If Ethan didn't take this seriously, why should they? I tried covering for him. Bringing extra reports, answering questions meant for him. But with each excuse, I felt the weight shifting more onto my shoulders, the balance between us tilting. One Friday afternoon, Charles called me into his office. "Madison," he said, "I appreciate everything you're doing. But this is Ethan's legacy too. He has to decide whether he's in or out." His voice was calm, but I heard the disappointment underneath. It reminded me of a truth my mother once shared. You can't carry someone who's chosen to sit down. You can support, encourage, even inspire, but you can't manufacture ambition. It has to come from within, and Ethan's spark seemed to be dimming more each day. By then, I'd learned to compartmentalize. At work, I stayed focused, negotiating contracts, streamlining budgets, visiting sites. At home, I tiptoed around conversations that might ignite tension. But I could feel the space between us growing, a quiet distance that had nothing to do with physical proximity. I told myself that marriages have seasons, that this was just a rough patch. What I didn't realize was that while I was building, Ethan was drifting, and into that empty space, someone else was about to step. Her name was Serena Hall, and she would arrive like a storm neither of us saw coming. Serena Hall had a way of entering a room that made you notice her before you even knew why. She was my half-sister, 3 years older, all striking features and quick wit. We'd grown up in the same house after my mother married her father, a man who didn't stay long but left Serena with his charm and his appetite for risk. Where I had chosen the steady climb, Serena preferred the quick win. She'd been married to a high-profile attorney, lived in a penthouse, and lost it all after a public affair. Serena didn't just chase dreams, she chased shortcuts. When she first reappeared in my life, it was under the pretense of catching up. She came to a charity event, her laughter bubbling over like champagne as she hugged me. Ethan was with me, and I noticed the way her eyes flickered toward him, a brief but unmistakable calculation. At the time, I brushed it off. Serena was always drawn to shiny things, designer shoes, fast cars, men with influence. Ethan's last name was a shiny thing, though he didn't carry it with the authority people assumed. Still, I should have paid closer attention to that flicker. Over the next few weeks, Serena found reasons to be around. She'd accidentally run into Ethan at a coffee shop near his gym or text me asking if we could all grab dinner. She laughed too loudly at his jokes, leaned in a little too close when she talked to him. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, she was my sister. Surely she wouldn't cross that line. But sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones capable of surprising us in the worst ways. Serena often spoke about reinventing herself, a phrase she used whenever she was between jobs or men. She envied stability, but never wanted to earn it. I remember her telling me once, "It's not about working harder, Maddie. It's about finding the right ladder to climb." To her, Ethan must have looked like the perfect ladder. What she didn't know was that the rungs weren't made of gold. They were paper held together by a company name that he barely touched. But illusions can be powerful, especially for someone desperate to rewrite her story. Looking back, I realized Serena's arrival was like a weather shift you don't notice until the storm is overhead. At the time, I was buried in board meetings, managing new developments, and negotiating with city planners. I told myself family was safe territory, that Ethan's lack of engagement with work meant he was safe from being targeted. I was wrong. While I was building something solid, Serena was testing the walls, looking for cracks. and soon she would find one big enough to change everything with just a few whispered words. It was a Tuesday evening when Ethan came home earlier than usual. He didn't drop his keys on the counter like he normally did. Instead, he stood in the doorway of the living room, his hands buried in his pockets. The television hummed in the background, but the room felt heavy. "Maddie, we need to talk," he said, and the tone in his voice made my stomach knot. Ethan rarely sounded serious. I set down my notebook, bracing for a conversation about work, or maybe his father. What I didn't expect were the words that would knock the air out of me. "Serena's pregnant," he said quietly. "It's mine. I want a divorce." For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing. Serena, my sister, pregnant, my husband's child. I tried to speak, but the words jammed in my throat. Betrayal has a strange weight, it's both heavy and hollow. I stared at Ethan, searching his face for some sign that this was a cruel joke. But he just looked down at the floor as if the grain of the hardwood was suddenly fascinating. That silence told me more than any explanation could. When trust shatters, it's not just the person you lose, it's the version of your life you thought was real. My mind flashed through years of moments with Ethan now recast in the shadow of Serena's presence. I remembered her leaning in too close at dinner, the way Ethan's eyes darted away when I mentioned her name. Hindsight is sharp, and it cut deep. But in that moment, I learned something my mother used to say. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden, it's just waiting for you to look straight at it. I asked him when she planned to tell me herself. He mumbled something about her visiting on my next day off. The casualness of it almost stunned me more than the betrayal. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice they'd both lived with long enough to rehearse. I thought of all the times I'd defended Ethan's absences at work, convinced myself his distance was temporary. All the while, he'd been investing his time elsewhere. In business, we call that a misallocation of resources. In marriage, it's a quiet dismantling of trust. The next morning, I drove to work like muscle memory was steering the wheel. My hands were steady on the boardroom table, my voice even as I reviewed budgets and timelines. But underneath, I was replaying Ethan's words on a loop. Betrayal has a way of sharpening priorities. I knew two things: I couldn't let this take my company from me, and I needed allies if I was going to protect what I'd built. That's when I decided to speak to Charles, not as Ethan's wife, but as the leader he'd trained me to be. Charles Brooks's study smelled faintly of leather and old paper, a place where every object seemed to carry weight. Framed photos of construction sites lined the walls, from muddy groundbreakings to ribbon-cutting ceremonies. I sat across from him, hands clasped, and told him everything: Ethan's confession, Serena's pregnancy claim, and the divorce. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Beside him, my mother-in-law gasped at the mention of a grandchild. But one sharp glance from Charles silenced her. I realized then this conversation wasn't about family drama. It was about the legacy he'd spent decades building and who he trusted to protect it. When I finished, Charles leaned back, studying me like he was weighing steel beams for strength. "Madison," he said finally, "you're the heart of this company. I don't care what Ethan does. You keep running things. I'll handle him." Relief washed over me, though. It carried a pang of sadness. This wasn't the approval of a father-in-law, it was the recognition of a business partner. In that moment, I understood something vital in a world built on power and money. Loyalty isn't always bound by blood. Sometimes it's bound by shared vision and proven results. Charles told me about his own early days, how his brother had nearly bankrupted their first project with careless spending. "Family can sink you faster than strangers," he said, his voice low. "That's why you choose who stands beside you based on their backbone, not their last name." His words struck me. I thought about how often we excuse behavior simply because someone is family. But in business and in life, blind loyalty can be as dangerous as betrayal. That day, I decided I would stop protecting Ethan's image at the expense of my own integrity. We talked about the legal implications next. The condo Ethan and I lived in was company property leased to executives at market rate. Serena might think she was moving into a luxury home for free, but Charles confirmed she had no claim. He promised the board would support me through the divorce, emphasizing that the company's stability depended on my leadership. His confidence in me wasn't just reassuring, it lit a fire. I left that study feeling steadier than I had in days, ready to face whatever Serena thought she could throw at me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, my version of a war room, reviewing contracts and pulling financial records. It felt almost like preparing for a high-stakes negotiation, except the stakes here were my career, my home, and my self-respect. Betrayal had taken enough from me. I wasn't about to let it strip away what I'd earned. In the morning, I'd be walking into a conference room where Serena would be waiting, confident she'd already won. She had no idea that the rules of the game weren't in her favor, and I was ready to prove it. The conference room on the 21st floor had floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the Charlotte skyline. Sunlight spilled across the long mahogany table where folders, contracts, and pens were neatly arranged. Serena arrived first, dressed in a fitted cream suit and carrying a designer handbag like it was a trophy. Ethan trailed behind her, looking like he wished he were anywhere else. My attorney, Julia Marks, sat beside me, calm and composed. I'd chosen this room intentionally. It was the same space where million-dollar deals were made. Today the deal was my future, and I intended to negotiate it on my terms. Serena wasted no time. "Let's make this easy, Maddie," she said, her tone sugar-coated but edged with steel. "Name your price for alimony, and I'll make sure you get enough to start over somewhere else." She spoke like she was doing me a favor, as if the Brooks name gave her the power to decide my worth. Julia smiled faintly and slid a document across the table. "Since you're offering, we'll be seeking alimony from both Ethan and you, Ms. Hall." Serena blinked, then laughed in disbelief until she saw the numbers. Her smile faltered. It's amazing how quickly confidence can crumble when faced with hard facts. Serena sputtered. "I'm already paying my ex-husband." Julia didn't flinch. "Then you know how this works." I watched Serena's eyes flicker, calculating her next move. In business, I'd seen the same reaction from over-leveraged developers when a deal turned against them. They'd overplayed their hand, and were now trapped by the fine print. It was a reminder that arrogance is often just ignorance in expensive clothing. Serena had walked into this room thinking she knew the terrain, but she hadn't studied the map. When the topic turned to property division, Serena leaned forward. "The condo belongs to Ethan's family. It's not part of the split." Julia answered before I could. "The condo belongs to Brooks Developments. It's leased to employees at market rate. That's not free." She slid another document showing the monthly figure. Ethan glanced at it, his face draining of color. "My salary can't cover that," he muttered. Serena's eyes widened, and for the first time she looked at Ethan like she was seeing him clearly. The man she thought was her golden ticket was just holding a ticket stub. I spoke then, keeping my voice steady. "Serena, you thought you were stepping into a life of privilege, but you weren't marrying the company, you were marrying an employee. And I'm the one running the company now." Her lips pressed into a thin line. The room was quiet except for the hum of the city outside. That silence was the sound of reality sinking in. I'd learned long ago that power in a negotiation often comes from saying less and letting the truth do the talking. Soon Serena would face a truth even harder to swallow. The truth about Serena's pregnancy unraveled faster than I expected. A week after the boardroom showdown, Charles received a discreet call from a mutual acquaintance, a doctor who confirmed Serena had fabricated the entire story. There was no baby, no due date, just a calculated lie to anchor herself to the Brooks family. When Charles confronted her, she tried to spin another tale, but his patience had worn thin. "You're nothing to this family," he said, voice like steel. For a man who valued loyalty above all, her betrayal was unforgivable. Serena's smile, once so practiced, finally cracked under the weight of exposure. Word spread quickly through Charlotte's tight-knit social circles. The same people who had once envied Serena's glamour now whispered about her deceit. Invitations stopped arriving. Her usual haunts felt colder, the smiles from acquaintances more brittle. I'd seen this before in business. When trust collapses, reputation follows. And reputation once broken is harder to rebuild than any skyscraper. Serena moved out of the condo within days, her designer luggage rolling across the marble lobby floor, leaving behind the echo of ambitions that had nowhere left to land. Ethan didn't walk her out. He just watched from the balcony, silent. Ethan's fall came differently, but no less sharply. Charles stripped him of his board seat, assigning him to a minor administrative role deep in the company's back offices. Gone were the corner office and catered lunches. In their place, piles of paperwork and a modest paycheck that barely covered his expenses. It wasn't punishment for punishment's sake. It was a test, a final chance to see if Ethan could rebuild from the ground up. But knowing him, I suspected the drive to climb had never really been there. Some people see a ladder and start climbing. Others just stand at the bottom. For me, the weeks after felt oddly quiet. There was no victory parade, no sense of gloating, just the steady hum of returning to my work. In the industry, you learn that storms pass, but they leave the ground changed. I'd lost a marriage, a sister, and some illusions about loyalty. But I'd also gained clarity that my worth was not tied to anyone's last name or approval. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me that grit and integrity outlast any scandal. The lesson was simple, but hard-earned. Your stability should never depend on someone else's shaky foundation. One evening, as I reviewed project updates in my office, I glanced at the skyline dotted with cranes. Each one was a promise of something new taking shape. The city-like life kept building forward. I knew part 10 of my story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about choosing what to construct with the pieces I still held. And for the first time in months, I felt excited to design something entirely my own. The next chapter wasn't going to be defined by what I'd lost, but by what I was ready to create. In the months that followed, my life took on a different rhythm. Without Ethan's shadow or Serena's schemes, there was room to breathe. I poured myself into Brooke's developments, not just as a business, but as a community. Every project became personal homes for families, starting fresh offices for small businesses, chasing their first big break. I carried lessons from my mother's kitchen table, the early mornings in finance, and the bruises left by betrayal. Each one was part of the foundation I stood on now. Stronger than the steel we used in our buildings, survival had turned into purpose. Looking back, the journey had been anything but straight. From a small-town girl with a scholarship in hand, to a wife thinking she'd found stability, to a CEO navigating boardroom politics and personal heartbreak, it was a series of unplanned turns. I'd learned that power isn't about titles or last names. It's about the choices you make when no one else can decide for you. Ethan and Serena's choices taught me what happens when you chase the appearance of success without building the substance. And Charles showed me the value of backing those who prove themselves. I started a scholarship fund for women entering construction management, a way to open doors that had once been closed to me. We hosted mentorship lunches where seasoned project managers shared stories that didn't make the headlines: delays, tough negotiations, moments of doubt. The truth is, resilience is built in those moments, not in the glossy press releases. I wanted the next generation to know that setbacks aren't the end, they're the groundwork for something new. It was my way of paying forward the trust and opportunities I'd been given. The skyline outside my office became more than a view. It was a reminder that we're all building something. Some people choose glass towers, others build quiet lives. What matters is that you lay each brick with intention. I thought about Ethan sometimes, not with bitterness, but as a chapter I'd finished. His choices were his to live with. Mine had led me here, steady, fulfilled, and unafraid of the work it takes to keep standing tall. Serena had vanished from the city's social pages, another reminder that shortcuts rarely last. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. You've walked with me through family fractures, corporate battles, and the quiet moments where I had to decide who I was going to be. If any part of my journey made you think about your own, I'd love to hear it. Share your story in the comments, your victories, your lessons, even your storms. And if you want more stories of resilience, grit, and starting over, hit that like button, subscribe, and join me here. We're all building something. Let's make sure it's worth standing on.